Hello and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Shackelford, and I'm a senior fellow on U.S. foreign policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thanks to all, but especially to our members, for joining us for this conversation today on redefining American power. Before we get started, please note that the Council is an independent and nonpartisan organization and takes no institutional policy positions. Views expressed by the participants on the program are their own. This program is part of the Lester Crown Center on U.S. Foreign Policy. A generous gift from the Crown family supports all of the center's efforts and the development of digital resources to make the Council's foreign policy content accessible across our platforms. If you have a question for the panel, we will be taking audience questions in about 30 minutes or so via ccga.live. Simply enter ccga.live into your browser. Follow the on-screen prompts, and you'll be able to submit or vote for your favorite question there. With that said, I'd like to welcome our panelists to the conversation. Andrew Bacevich is president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and is author of the new book, After the Apocalypse, America's Role in a World Transformed, which is available for sale by our partner, The Bookseller. A direct link can be found on the event page. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. So I just want to start, Andrew, by saying that what I find so compelling about this book is that with every chapter, you take on basic, long-standing kind of tenets of US foreign policy, beliefs that have been building blocks of so much of what we do in the name of the American people overseas. And you basically say, not so fast, wait a minute, that's not actually true. Here's what that premise comes from. Here's what it's founded on, and this is why it's not really right. Your book starts with the pandemic year, the apocalypse, as you describe it, and you explain how our vulnerability as a nation to COVID-19, physically and economically, exposed how poorly prepared our national security sector is to address our biggest threats. But you also argue that this is a problem that we've had for a long time. So just to introduce this discussion, I wanted to know if you could start by explaining what is that foundation of what you describe as this chronically misguided foreign policy. And what premise do you think we should be building our foreign policy on instead?
Well, first of all, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the provocative question. And I think that the foundation of my critique of U.S. policy, which I've been writing about long before this book, stems from my conviction that the belief in American exceptionalism, which has been a source of energy, has provided a rationale for our rise to power, has also come to be deeply pernicious. American exceptionalism has translated into a claim of American primacy. You know, that history has a purpose, and we express that purpose. Our definition of freedom is meant to be a universal definition. And finally, the conviction that really came to the fore after the end of the Cold War, the conviction that the possession and use of military power ought to enable us to fulfill and sustain those aspirations to primacy and to then complete the mission that we are called upon to fulfill. And those together, American exceptionalism, a belief in primacy, a conviction that military power is a useful instrument, I think those have done great harm to our country, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years. And the purpose of my book is to say, well, maybe there are other ways to conceive of our role in the world.
So I want to kind of break down the American exceptionalism part. So I was a diplomat before, and I often found that sentiment that America is this special and unique nation. It's not just a belief we have here. I mean, we've done a pretty good job of exporting that idea. And sometimes, I found that sentiment overseas was a really strong soft power tool for the US. And I imagine a reality where even if we acknowledge, our flaws, and you talk about a lot of them, that it can still be a useful soft power tool. But I'm curious if you see any value in preserving and promoting that image of America's kind of special nature, or and if not, why not?
I guess I would say this, that uh, as long as we're not shoving it down other people's throats. In other words, if we said it is our purpose to demonstrate the validity of liberal democratic values, to show that adhering to liberal democratic values does in fact provide a model that others might find useful, I think I'd say sign me up for that. But particularly since World War II, and even more so since the end of the Cold War, we've tended to take a shove it down your throat approach. And the instrument for doing the shoving is military power. The most vivid examples, I think, are the post 9/11 efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I emphatically believe that those were wrong-headed endeavors that did enormous damage to ourselves and arguably even greater damage to the peoples that we profess to wish to liberate.
Mhm. No, absolutely. I mean, and that sentiment that it's different to push out the idea of American exceptionalism means that we can do certain things versus the idea of American specialness. So let's demonstrate by example. I think I can certainly see that core differentiation. So one of your core arguments is that we're handicapped by how we define and imagine what national security means. And how the current definition leaves out a wide variety of threats that are a lot more proximate and dangerous to the American people than some of the things that we target with our military might, as you describe. Can you talk a little bit about what our national security should be more focused on, and how we can reimagine that national security structure within our government so that we're better prepared to address those threats, and not just talking about obviously the military aspect, but how can we rethink that system?
Well, but first, let's talk just a little bit about the military as the primary instrument of national security, and talk about the way our military is designed. The United States military is not designed to defend the United States of America. It's designed to project power. How do we know that? Well, we know that in part because of the architecture of the United States military, with the something on the order of 800 foreign bases. I understand some of those bases are probably 2 acres in size, and others are tens of square miles. But that's where our military positions itself. It positions itself abroad because it's designed to intervene abroad. The purpose of the United States Army is not to defend. The purpose of the United States Army is to get on airplanes and ships and go to the Persian Gulf or go to the Korean Peninsula. That is a deeply ingrained habit, that national security is achieved by going out there, by using our power and influence out there. I think it's a direct consequence of that back here has not been particularly attended to. 9/11, of course, is perhaps the most painful example of that. 19 young men with box cutters successfully assault our nation's political capital and financial capital, killing 3,000 people. While the enormous U.S. military establishment basically stood by helplessly. And I think that the events of last year, and still this year, the pandemic, say something of the same. I mean, it is, I know it's a fact we all know, but I think it's a fact that sort of we need to reflect on. 600,000 of our fellow citizens killed in this pandemic. substantially more Americans than died in World War II. And this just happened. And the national security establishment basically was reduced to, doing flyovers by the Blue Angels, to say nice things about first responders. So there's something fundamentally wrong here. What are the threats? What are the threats that we should worry about? Yeah, pandemics, obviously an example. Environmental deterioration, climate change, secure borders. And I don't mean secure borders in the sense that we should be, beaten up on these impoverished people from Central America are desperate to find a decent way of life, but borders that allow the transshipment of drugs and of weapons and of criminal elements. That's the problem. It seems to me much. It's not that there are not problems out there with the actions of the People's Republic of China or the actions of Russia or the actions of Iran. But it seems to me that we have paid too little attention to providing for the well-being and security of Americans where they live. To me, that's the key phrase, where they live, where we live. That simply requires a lot more attention from Washington than it's gotten, in my view.
And that brings me to think about, after 9/11, we really, dramatically shifted our focus towards this to be 2-decade long focus on counterterrorism as our primary, national security concern. And that was, as you've reminded us, that was a few thousand Americans perished in 9/11, as opposed to, hundreds of thousands in this pandemic. Do you foresee this waking up the foreign policy establishment and kicking off, the kind of shift that we saw after 9/11? I mean, I'll say I'm not seeing signs of that necessarily so far, but I'm curious if you think that level of crisis might be something that helps push our national security establishment to focus on some of these things that you've mentioned.
I can't say that I'm very optimistic. The President Biden and his principal appointees in senior positions in the national security establishment, they're all pretty conventional thinkers. I mean, they're not in the school of George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld. They're not inclined to undertake preventive wars like the Iraq War, believing that somehow that's going to fix our problems. They're individuals who are far more prudent, but they don't seem to be particularly imaginative. As far as I can tell, the Pentagon budget's going to go up. There's no serious evaluation going on. There are adjustments. We're pulling out of Afghanistan, but no serious evaluation going, as far as I can tell, about major changes in the national security establishment's global posture. I think there's one overdue. There's no interest that I can tell in doing that in the Congress because, among other things, the Congress, I'll state the matter bluntly, is in hock to the military-industrial complex. So the constituency for undertaking a serious critique of national security policy over the past quarter century is pretty limited. Quite frankly, is pretty feeble. There are discussions that happen online. There are articles written, but it seems to me that the forces that favor the status quo are deeply entrenched and they are powerful. And so I don't really see a lot of change on the horizon.
Yeah, it's hard to miss the fact that this administration brought in a lot of people who have served in prior administrations and are part of that established foreign policy community. Which brings me to another question, which I had as I was reading the book. You make a lot of recommendations that could fairly dramatically alter our foreign policy approach and our relationships in the world. Concrete recommendations. Who is the target audience for your book, and who are you hoping to reach and persuade with it? Because as you said, I'm not sure that the establishment is really hankering for big change.
Well, I think my target audience would be our fellow citizens who, coming out of 2020, that's my apocalypse year, our fellow citizens who, coming out of 2020, are willing to consider the possibility that things are fundamentally wrong in our country, to include things are fundamentally wrong in the way we have chosen to play our role in world affairs. And this is crucial, and who are not content simply to blame everything on Donald Trump. I mean, let's face it, there are any number of our fellow citizens who, if you said to them, define the source of the problem, the answer is Donald Trump is the source of the problem. I think he is an expression of the problem, symptom of the problem, but the origins go much deeper. So my book, I hope, would have some appeal to people who are willing to consider, look for those deeper explanations.
You know, that feeds into a little bit of one of the themes we keep hearing from this administration. The Biden administration and Secretary Blinken repeatedly talk about how they want to pursue this foreign policy for the middle class. And, you know, one of the things I keep thinking as I hear that is, well, in order to do that, you have to have some sense of what the middle class wants and is interested in foreign policy. So do you think there's some ways, and I like that your book is directed at that audience as well, you know, what do you think that the administration could be doing to draw more on and engage in more of a two-way conversation with, you know, normal Americans outside the Washington establishment?
That's a really good question. I really haven't thought about that question, but it's a really good one. And I think my answer is that to be willing to acknowledge, I mean, the president at the bully pulpit, talking to the American people, to be willing to acknowledge how badly we went astray after the end of the Cold War, to be willing to acknowledge that going astray was a bipartisan project, and that only if we are willing to examine that period, you know, examine the period from 1989 to the present, and from my point of view, in particular, to examine the misuse of military power during that period, only then would it be possible for us to have a conversation about, well, then, what should the alternatives be? Are there other ways that we should be spending our money than the ways we habitually spend our money? But I don't get a sense that there is much willingness to have that conversation. You know, one of the interesting things, I think, that one of the really interesting things that's going on in our country right now, of course, is the reckoning with regard to racism. That can go too far, you know, to somehow assign everything that happens in America to the tradition of racism. But there cannot be a doubt that a serious reckoning is required and is now underway. We cannot tell where that reckoning will end up, but it certainly is necessary. I think there's a comparable reckoning to be had with regard to US foreign policy. To some degree, we're still stuck in World War II. We still believe that the image that came out of World War II of America as liberator is still relevant today. And I would argue that it's not. First of all, I'd argue that that image was, from the very point of origin, somewhat suspect. But more importantly, the world order has changed so radically that only if we come to a clearer understanding of what we've been doing, is it going to be possible to make the necessary adjustments to our basic policy that I believe in are in order. Until then, we just keep reiterating, the same sort of cliches, and don't make the necessary reforms.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned. I mean, the domestic issue of facing racism right now, because in your book, I found it very interesting that you draw this connection between our historical racism in this country, and that being part of what our foreign policy is built on. You talk about a connection between kind of American privilege being a version of kind of white privilege on the international stage. But you also talk about how our country's legacy of racism has really shaped our foreign policy too. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? I found it a really interesting part of the book.
I think you may be pointing to the chapter that's least well developed, but let me try. So I was born in 1947, grew up during the Cold War, baby boomer. And the version of history that I think shaped my consciousness was a version of history that was centered on conflict among powerful, predominantly white nations. There were geopolitical competitions, there were ideological competitions, but the story tended to be us and the Brits against the Germans, or us and the Brits against the Russians. And therefore, the result was basically to exclude everybody else, to exclude the global South. Here we are in the 21st century. That sort of Western-centered narrative simply is utterly inadequate. And we need to outgrow it. And we need, I think, to come to appreciate that however important, obviously it was important, that the United States and its allies, to include the Soviet Union, would stand firm against Nazi Germany and bring about the destruction of Nazi Germany. In retrospect, the story of white colonization and oppression of people in Africa and in Asia and in Southeast Asia, and here in the Western Hemisphere, even though we indulged in a limited amount of formal colonization, nonetheless, there was informal imperialism. And that entire narrative, which traditionally is sort of placed on the periphery, I think now has to come much more toward the center. And if we put it in the center, then it seems to me we come to a fundamentally different understanding of what our role in the world ought to be in this new era.
Yeah, I mean, I got to this part of the book where you basically say the study of Western civilization, that course that people took, that's basically a racist construct. And it was a little bit it was one of those many moments in the book where you think, oh, I've just taken for granted for all this time. So those are the types of really provocative ideas that I think it's great. You say it's not particularly well developed, that concept of how our foreign policy is founded in this racism, but I think it is. I think that recognizing that was where our country was when all of this kind of the foundations of today's foreign policy was coming about, is it really does make you think. I want to take a moment to remind our audience that in a few minutes we'll be starting to take questions from the audience. So please go to ccga.live to put your questions in the mix, or vote on questions that you most want to hear an answer to. All right, I want to turn now to you've dedicated a number of pages in the book towards, well, you talk a lot about our different special relationships between the United States and other countries, and one that you discuss over several pages is U.S. policy towards Israel, and how it really, the way that it's designed and that it's developed over time, really tilts in Israel's favor while doing very little to help U.S. national security. So I'm curious how you might design or change our foreign policy towards Israel today. And kind of as a specific example, how might you have suggested the U.S. should have responded to the recent violence between Israel and the Gaza Strip?
Well, I think the simple answer to that is to stop taking sides. The United States likes to present itself as playing the role of honest broker in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. I don't think there's any serious person that actually believes that that has been our role. In fact, our role has tilted strongly in favor of Israel. What's the evidence? Well, I mean, the evidence is, what is it now? 3.5, $3.8 billion of, let's be blunt, weaponry that we give to the state of Israel on an annual basis. I think the last agreement was for us to agree to do that for the next decade. Virtually no strings attached. The justification, the nominal justification, is to ensure that the state of Israel has a technological edge. What it really is to ensure the unquestioned military superiority of the state of Israel against any conceivable array of regional adversaries. Now, there was a day when Israel was a weak and underdeveloped nation that was genuinely threatened by an array of neighbors. The neighbors never managed to get their act together collectively, but there was a real threat. That's simply no longer the situation that exists. The Israeli per capita income, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's equivalent of the UK's. It's a developed nation. It no longer needs that kind of handout. And the handout is both symbol and substance of the fact that we favor one side against the other side. I think that the result is that we are perpetuating this conflict. The notion of a two-state solution is a charade. Why should we participate in that charade? I think we should not do so. I think we should no longer simply provide cover for the state of Israel in the United Nations Security Council when resolution, not that we should vote against the state of Israel on a particular resolution, but we should simply take matters as they come, issues as they are presented, looking at the issue from the point of view of US interests and regional stability, and act accordingly. President Washington, in the famous farewell address, warned against special relationships, which he warned caused us to lose sight of our own interests. And I think that the relationship between the United States and the state of Israel in the present moment really validates President Washington's warning. So we need to rethink that. Again, to emphasize, rethinking the special relationship does not mean turning against Israel. It does not mean standing in opposition to the reasonable requirements of Israeli security. But I think we need to take a more balanced approach.
A couple of themes that I saw in your book and that this reminds me of is, you mention a lot the dishonesty of U.S. foreign policy, and also a theme which you allude to is just the inertia that drives a lot of what we do and how we do things because we've been doing them and because we don't go back and reassess. So an interesting one for me is the question of NATO, because you have pretty strong views that NATO is an alliance that has kind of outlived its purpose. Can you talk a little bit about what you would do if you kind of had the power of the pen on what U.S. position should be with NATO moving forward?
But let's begin making the case for why I think that the U.S. participation in this alliance is obsolete. And the answer is a very simple one. Because the conditions that justified the creation of NATO back in 1949, the conditions that made US participation in NATO at that time absolutely essential, both for the security of Western Europe and for our security, those conditions have gone away. What were those conditions? Well, post-war Europe was flat on its back. Not simply economically devastated, but I think psychologically devastated. For Western Europe to recover, it required a concrete demonstration of support from the United States. And the demonstration came in multiple ways. Marshall Plan would be another example, but the security guarantee that NATO provided played a crucial role in enabling Western Europe to recover. All that, of course, happening in the context of Stalin's Soviet Union out there posing a threat. Well, guess what? All that's changed. All that's gone. I don't think in 2021, Europe is like a perfect place. But those of us who have visited in Europe pre-pandemic cannot help but be impressed by the fact that it's prosperous, it's dynamic. The EU has created a community of relative harmony. Again, not perfect. The UK bails out. But nonetheless, Europe really is a success story. And we have other things to do. So it seems to me that the time has come not to kill not to kill NATO, but for the United States to withdraw from NATO. Basically to communicate to the European heads of state, it is now time for you collectively to resume responsibility for your own security. I'm not saying we leave NATO next Tuesday. What I would say is next Tuesday, we say, fellas and gals, at the end of the present decade, the United States is withdrawing from the alliance. Therefore, you have a number of years to figure out what would be the basis of a collective security arrangement without the direct participation of the United States. And one more point. Our critics claim that it's our purpose to run the world. And Europe allows us to give the lie to that accusation. In other words, Europe allows, we can cite Europe and say, we've accomplished our mission. We have helped bring into existence a community of stable, prosperous, democratic countries willing to coexist, and therefore we're going home. And the fact that we can demonstrate that we helped to achieve this, helped, not all by ourselves, but helped to achieve this in Europe, I think suggests the possibility of being able to achieve that in other parts of the world. But if we maintain this military alliance in perpetuity, it's hard to rebut the charge that, it's hard to rebut the kind of charges we hear from Beijing these days, that we want to run everything.
All right, I'm going to turn to some audience questions now. The first one we have, which fits into this, how do you see restructuring the military as a defensive force? And what specific changes do you recommend, and how would these be implemented? Big question.
Huge question. First of all, the Pentagon budget can be substantially reduced. The American military footprint abroad can be substantially reduced. I think I'm choosing my words fairly carefully. I didn't say bring them all home, isolationism. I don't think we need all those bases. Let's look at the problem regionally. I just made the case that, from my point of view, the US military presence in Europe is redundant. It's not necessary. I would close it down. I would close down US European Command. I would eliminate, if not all, most of our bases, certainly ending any large-scale US troop presence in Europe, because it's not needed. Let's look at the Middle East, the greater Middle East, which has been a centerpiece of US military activity, particularly since 9/11, although in some respects going all the way back to 1980. I judge that effort to have been a failure. I look at the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. I look at the objectives that were defined by American presidents to bring stability, to bring democracy. I see just the opposite outcomes. In other words, in the greater Middle East, the US military presence has been counterproductive, and therefore it should end. We should withdraw from the region. We should find other ways to try to build stability in the region, which means relying to a greater extent on democracy. But let's talk about East Asia. The centerpiece there of the nexus of change is the rise of the People's Republic of China, which is today a great power. But there are other changes in the region. For example, the growing power and influence of India, the nervousness of countries such as Japan, South Korea, Australia, Vietnam, the Philippines, as they watch these nearby developments. There, I would argue that the presence of US forces has a stabilizing effect. Or to put it another way, if we withdrew US forces from Japan and South Korea, I think it would probably trigger an arms race, and it probably would cause great consternation and instability. So there, my argument is US military presence serves a purpose and therefore should be continued. So it all depends on circumstance. It's not one thing or the other. Now, with regard to defending the American people at home, I think we're probably under-investing in certain security agencies. And my favorite is the Coast Guard. You know, I admire the Coast Guard. I admire the many different things that our Coast Guard contributes to the well-being of the American people. You know, whether we're talking, counter narcotics, or we're talking about maritime security or the environment, we got a great Coast Guard, and it's radically underfunded and it's too small. So to me, I used to be in the Army. To me, I'd probably cut a couple of US Army divisions if I could expand the size of and modernize the United States Coast Guard, because what they do contributes more directly and immediately to the well-being of the American people.
Interesting. And you've answered part of one of our other audience questions, but I want to bring it in because it brings in, we haven't covered it entirely. This attendee has asked, Israel and Middle East is one area where we're brandishing military might, but what about China and Russia? Does not projected American might prevent our rivals from indulging in bad behavior? And you've answered this to an extent on China. You do believe that we need to maintain a presence to keep stability in that region, but at the same time, you feel that NATO is obsolete. What's your view on Russia and whether and how we need to counter any threats from there?
Well, you know, the famous description of Russia as what upper Volta with missiles. Russia is not the Soviet Union. Putin is a bad actor. He's not Joseph Stalin. There's no doubt that Russia today is a mischief maker. It does not represent some kind of an ideology with universal aspirations. So I think Russia actually poses a relatively modest threat. It ought to be taken seriously. It ought to be handled by Europe. I mean, to me, one of the travesties of the past 20 years is that after 9/11, when the United States chose to intervene in Afghanistan, we overthrew the Taliban. We for the last 20 years, we've been trying to create an effective government in Afghanistan. That throughout most of that period of time, NATO has been a partner. NATO has been a partner in a failed mission in Afghanistan. Why are they in Afghanistan? I mean, again, my view is that NATO, meaning the alliance other than the United States and Canada, the alliance ought to tend to its knitting. And that means tending to the territorial integrity and protection of its members in Europe. And I would assert that Europe is fully capable of doing that if European leaders chose to do so. You know, Trump got a lot of bad press, probably deserved it, got a lot of bad press when he was, beaten up, complaining constantly about NATO's European members for not spending enough money on their own defense. Of course, he wasn't the first president to make that complaint. And the complaint's entirely justified. Elizabeth, you probably know this better than I, but I believe that the NATO benchmark is that every NATO member is supposed to spend, I think it's 2% of GDP on defense. Virtually no members, certainly not Germany, which is the most prosperous, hits that 2% benchmark. So they are free riders. They are getting away with what Trump accused them of getting away with. And I think it should be viewed as intolerable.
So this brings us to another, all of these keep falling right into interesting questions because it relates to Russia these days. The US was blessed with an ocean on either side, but they are meaningless in cyberspace. How should the US position itself vis-a-vis cyber, including the potential that it could spark a kinetic war?
Well, I'm the last person on earth to pretend to be an expert in cyber matters because I'm so backward when it comes to tech. Let us understand that for all the talk about norms and the need to respect norms, that we ourselves have led the way in violating norms with regard to cyber behavior. You know, we ourselves, we think probably in conjunction with Israel, launched the first major cyber attack several years ago, targeting Iran. So, you know, for us to point the finger and say shame, shame, is somewhat hypocritical. That said, yeah, there need to be norms, but the norms need to be negotiated. I would say that that's one thing that seems to be going on within the Biden administration that is commendable. Whether or not that effort will succeed, I don't know. It'll never succeed 100%. But if we can largely get nations to adhere to a certain set of norms, why? Not because people are nice, but because adherence to those norms will be mutually beneficial. You know, having rules of the road that are generally respected will be mutually beneficial. I don't know if those negotiations are going to succeed, but I certainly think that we're on the right track. If we go down the path of tit for tat retaliations, then who knows where they will end? And your questioner is right. You know, then when do we hit a point of transitioning from cyber attacks to real attacks with God knows what consequences? We always have to remember, you know, we live in a world in which nuclear weapons are out there, and preventing any further use of nuclear weapons has to be a primary objective of all powers in the world.
Well, we've got just a couple of minutes left, so I want to squeeze in one last audience question because I find this one really interesting. Do you see any individuals or groups in the US political arena who understand your arguments and have formed or promoted policies that reflect your understanding of our reality? Is there some grassroots movement that could help develop a countervailing power to the status quo?
I'm smiling because it's like you just threw me a softball that I can hit out of the park. It's not a grassroots organization, but it's the organization that I'm privileged to be president of, the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. We are a small startup think tank in Washington, D.C., devoted to a very particular set of principles. Can be summed up in one word: restraint. military restraint. That is not isolationism. We believe in engagement, but we believe that in engagement through other than military means, trade, diplomacy, culture. Again, we're a startup. We got a long way to go, but it's a great privilege for me to be a part of this undertaking.
Well, we have just hit our time, so I think that's a great place to end on. Thank you to everyone who tuned in live. And as a reminder, a recording of this conversation is also going to be available for playback on the Council's social channels and the website very shortly. And as a reminder, Andrew's new book, After the Apocalypse, America's Role in a World Transformed, is available for sale by our partner, The Bookseller. A direct link can be found on the event page. I want to give you a special thanks, Andrew, for joining us today on the program. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Really enjoyed it, and I hope everyone else did too. Thank you.
It's my privilege to be with you. Thank you.